Well, our guest of honor is here, and as people are assembling, we should probably get going nonetheless because our time is short. So, Marvin, if we can lift the slide, we can start the program. Thanks a lot. Well, everybody, good afternoon. Welcome back to the Council of the Americas, hopefully before too long, but not until the new year for sure, probably well into the new year. Will we be able to see each other again in person? So this will have to do, but we appreciate all of you joining us via WebEx for what promises to be a really interesting program today on the plight of Venezuela's returning refugees with David Smolansky, who's a good personal friend and a friend of the Council of the Americas, friend of Guillermo Subiad and others in the organization, and has just taken a very important position with the Secretary General of the OAS as a special envoy for Venezuela's refugees and migration issues. My name is Eric Farnsworth. I head the Washington office of the Council of the Americas. Delighted to be your host today. Just a couple housekeeping items, David, before turning it over to you. The first is that this is an on-the-record program, so you can use what is said here publicly, and we trust that you will find it suitably important and valuable to do so. We would ask that you keep yourselves on mute until and unless recognized in the question and answer period later in the session. And in order to be recognized, just send me a private chat. I'm sure by now everybody knows how to do that. Just send it directly to me. We'll add you to the queue, and then we'll be able to have that conversation after David finishes with his presentation. Well, as we all know, Venezuela is a country that's in crisis, a country of 33 million people with estimates range between 5 and 6 million citizens now outside of the country as refugees, essentially a country that at one point was the richest, the wealthiest country in Latin America per capita is now, according to some estimates, even poorer and with higher poverty levels than Haiti, which is among the very poorest countries in the entire world. That's a scenario that has been brought on over the past 20 years with no particular end in sight or way to abate the current crisis. And the people of Venezuela, as always happens, are the ones bearing the brunt of this crisis. And so they're voting with their feet. They're leaving Venezuela. In some cases, because of COVID, they're starting to return to Venezuela now because of circumstances. And so you have a bit of a reverse migration too, which is making things even more complicated. David Smolansky, as I mentioned, is the special envoy for the Secretary General of the OAS. He needs no introduction because we've hosted him several times here at the Council of the Americas. And so I'm not going to give you, David, the introduction you deserve because I prefer to allow you to speak, but simply to say that in a country in crisis, David stands out as one of the true patriots of the country, somebody who cares so deeply about his country that he's put himself and his family at personal risk to try to bring positive change, to return to democracy, to return to growth, and to return to the potential that the Venezuelan people have and that we all know so well. So he is somebody who's taking real risks for peace and development and to return to a strengthened country, hopefully at some point in the very near future. He is somebody who I mentioned we have hosted before. We've hosted him in different capacities, though. So today we've asked him to come and discuss a recent report that he and some of his colleagues have made to the Secretary General about the refugee crisis being engendered by Mr. Maduro. And then he also has some comments about broader political developments and trends within Venezuela. So I'm anxious to hear from him. I know all of you are as well. And with that, David, let me welcome you back to the Council of the Americas and offer the floor to you. Thanks again for joining us. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Eric, for inviting me. It's always an honor, a pleasure to be at the Council of Americas, and thank you to you and your team for organizing this conference. And also, I would like to express my gratitude to everyone who is connected right now and is making an effort to share your time for this important matter, the Venezuelan migration and refugee crisis. As Eric explained, we released a report last month that consisted on the situation of Venezuelans that have returned to their country due COVID-19, or the ones who still are trying to go back to Venezuela. So when we released, Eric invited us to for this conference, and before getting in detail about that report and some of the things that have happened since the release that was almost a month ago, it's important always to remind the dimension of this refugee crisis. Maybe a lot of the ones who are in this conference know about it, but I always like to remind how big and how impactful is this refugee crisis in the region. As we speak, the last numbers that were released by the governments of the region, that they shared those numbers with us at the OES and with the UN platform response for this crisis, is that we're talking of 5.5 million Venezuelan refugees as we speak. 4.6 million out of the 5.5 are in Latin America and the Caribbean. Officially, this is the largest refugee crisis in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean. And as we speak, the Venezuelans are the second largest refugee crisis in the world, only behind Syria. But Venezuelans are the first or the largest refugee population that have not gone through a war or a natural catastrophe. This is a man-made disaster, and a man-made disaster that have caused a refugee flow similar to countries that have gone through war or that have gone through natural catastrophe. Colombia is a country with more Venezuelan migrants and refugees, 1.8 million. After Colombia, Peru is in approximately 900,000. Then Chile with 455,000. Ecuador, 400,000. Brazil, 270,000. And Argentina, 170,000. That's what I call the G6. Those are the 6 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that have received more Venezuelan migrants and refugees. But this is something that has gone through the whole Americas. In Mexico, there are almost 100,000 Venezuelan migrants and refugees. In Panama, the same number. And this is something that I always like to share. The Caribbean. In the Caribbean, there is approximately 150,000 Venezuelan migrants and refugees. When you see Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, the ABC Island, and Dominican Republic, almost 150,000 Venezuelans are in the Caribbean. So just to make a comparison, almost the same amount of Venezuelan migrants and refugees are in the Caribbean that are in Argentina. And when you go to relative number, because we always talk about absolute numbers, so when we go to relative numbers, Aruba and Curacao have the highest rate of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. 15% of the migrants and refugees, 15% of the whole population of Aruba and Curacao are already Venezuelans. So this is, as I said, this is something unprecedented in the region. Venezuela used to be a country that for decades received so many refugees and migrants from the Caribbean, from Latin America, from Europe, people that were fleeing of war or dictatorships or the collapse of the economy, and now is the other way around. So since COVID-19 officially started in this part of the world, the borders of Venezuela have been shut down, and the borders have been closed for more than 200 days. So this is something that we started to follow very closely, because from our office, something that we were really concerned is that if a refugee is a person vulnerable, COVID-19 makes this person more vulnerable. So during the last 7 months, there is a new chapter of this migration and refugee flows And what we have seen is Venezuelans desperate, trying to return to their homeland. Basically, there are three main reasons why. The first is that Venezuelans want to be as close as possible to their families because they are really, really worried about the consequences that COVID-19 could have in Venezuela, where, as we know, the health system is completely in shatters with lack of medicines. The other reason Venezuelans are going back is because they have lost their jobs or they depend on informal job. So before staying on unemployed or staying on the streets, they just decided to go back to Venezuela. And then there were some cases, especially at the beginning between March and April, of people that were taken out of their homes. So they became homeless, and when they became homeless, they started literally to walk to Venezuela. So approximately 112,000 Venezuelans have gone back since COVID-19 started. The vast majority from Colombia, 105,000, and approximately 6,000 from Brazil. But I also have to say that this is not only something about Venezuelans who have returned, but also the ones who have tried to return, because there are thousands of Venezuelans that were able to take a flight before COVID-19 started for family reasons, for business reasons, or whatever. Even though we know that flights in Venezuela are very limited, but still there are some people who can use those flights and travel. And approximately we have registered, and I'm sure that we are not on the number exactly because that's higher, but at least we have registered 3,000 Venezuelans who have not been able to return to their homeland and to be again with their families. In the US, we have registered a bit more than 1,000. Between Chile and Argentina, approximately there is 800. Also between Costa Rica and Panama, approximately is 100, and in Spain is almost 500. We are talking people that have not been able to go back, as I said, to be with their families. And I want to remember that any human being has a right to go back to their countries, and this right has been denied or has been managed discretionally by Maduro's regime, with these people suffering from discrimination. And the only way that these people have the opportunity to go back to Venezuela is taking a flight, because the 112,000 that have returned, they have done it walking. But the others that need a flight from Argentina or from the US or from Spain, that right has been denied. And this is something that it takes my attention, and we put it in the report, because in a very conservative estimation, 3,000 people could go back in Venezuela in 15 flights. If you have 200 people per flight, and this is a very conservative number because we know that a flight could take 300, 400 people. If you take a flight of 200 people with 15 flights, those people could be with their family again. But why we put this under this report? Because since COVID-19 started, 18 flights from Iran have arrived to Venezuela. So for the Iranians, borders have been completely open, with lack of transparency of what Iranians are doing in Venezuela. But for Venezuelans to go back on a humanitarian flight in the context of a pandemic, that right has been denied. Talking again about the 112,000 that have gone back to their country. In this report that is in Spanish and in English, and you can find it very easily on the OAS website and also at the social media of the OAS or mine personal. One of the things that we work really hard is first to have first-hand testimonies. So we talked to at least 15 people that were able to return to Venezuela or are trying to return to Venezuela. And second, we documented all the aggressions, threats that the regime has made against those Venezuelans. And this is very concerning. From Nicolás Maduro to Diosdado Cabello, Delcy Rodriguez, Freddy Bernal, they have called, and the armed forces, specifically Remigio Ceballos, which is something even more concerning, they have called Venezuelans who have gone back as bioterrorists. They have called Venezuelans who have gone back as a biological weapon. They have also marked some Venezuelan, some houses of Venezuela who have returned to explain the people on those communities, though that in that house lives someone who fled Venezuela and was a traitor and now has gone back. The official Twitter account of the what we know in Venezuela, the Comando Estratégico Operacional de la Fuerza Armada Nacional, the CEO of the armed force, if you can call it, they put a message calling for people to denounce if they know someone returned to Venezuela. And they actually put a mail where someone could do a denounce without giving their identity. And 100 Venezuelans have been detained since this operation started, and 30 of them have already been condemned from 6 to 10 years in prison. And some of them have been illegally detained at the northern border of Venezuela with Colombia and have been transported to the southeast of Venezuela, which is bordered with Brazil, to the El Dorado jail. So many of the other people are disappear. They were offered to have 3 meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and that has not happened. Venezuelans also have denounced on the report that we released extortion from the security forces or irregular groups. There are so many. There are security. So there are 2 ways that they are returning. One is on the regular way with the humanitarian assistance that the government of Colombia and Brazil have provided. So they have gone back to regular ways. When they get to Venezuela, they have suffered from extortion from security forces asking for dollars or pesos colombianos to get transported to other cities in Venezuela. As you can imagine, not everyone who returns to Venezuela live in a border state. They go to other places such as Caracas, the capital, or cities at the east of Venezuela. And others, because it has been very irregular the way how Maduro has handled the borders, on the desperation, they have taken the irregular path, what we know in Spanish as trochas. On those trochas, the security has been, the security forces has basically given that to irregular groups such as the ELN. And we have been told that they have several borders controlled or points of extortion, and they ask for $5 for each extortion point of control. So at the end, we have a testimony, for example, a person that went to 10, he had to go through 10 point of control of the ELN, and he paid $50. So he basically, when they get to Venezuela, he didn't have anything, because we're talking about people that are in a very vulnerable situation, that are probably, as I said, they are unemployed, they are suffering from starvation, or they have some health issues. But as I said, the worries that they have about the consequences of COVID-19 with their families are trying to be as close as possible to their families. So this is another firm and clear evidence on how Venezuelans are suffering of human rights violations, or how Venezuelans are suffering of crime against humanity, and how Maduro's regime doesn't respect any Venezuelans, and he couldn't care less about the situation and the vulnerability of Venezuelans. We gave some recommendations on this report, and we actually, one of the recommendations that we said is that the responsibles of these threats and aggressions and bad treatment to Venezuelans should be investigated for crimes against humanity, and that happened actually even before the fact-finding mission of the UN released this report. Also, we asked the international community to raise awareness on this situation and act protecting Venezuelans. Don't think because Venezuelans get back to their countries, they're in a good situation. And also, it's very important for Venezuelans who have not been able to go back. We're talking, for example, about 30,000 Venezuelans who are still in the border with Colombia, and the others that I said in different countries, that if they could get some protection while they are in this situation, because as I said, their right to go back have not been guaranteed. So, as I said, this was released almost a month ago. Things are getting more complicated at the border. That's one of the things that I wanted to add, Eric, if I may. And now Venezuelans who return desperately are trying to go back to Colombia, Brazil, or any other part, because, of course, the situation in Venezuela has gotten worse. So, according to authorities of migration in Colombia, which we always are in contact, they are estimating that since during the last 2 weeks, at least 500 Venezuelans are getting to Colombia through illegal path, because borders, is important to everyone knows here that borders are still closed. Land border with Brazil, with Colombia, and the sea border with the Caribbean are still closed. So people desperately, in the case of Colombia, are taking the trochas, there are hundreds of trochas, illegal path, to get to Colombia. And during the last 2 weeks, approximately 500 Venezuelans are getting to Colombia through illegal path. Of course, they're suffering again from extortion, because those irregular groups are still on the trochas, and they always will extortion to you. It doesn't matter if you go back to Venezuela or if you're going to Colombia. Colombia has already announced that from 200 security forces, 200 officials from security forces, they have now taken that number to 900 officials from security forces to take care of the irregular path. We're also documenting something which is, in my opinion, is probably the most devastated, one of the most devastated things that I'm seeing in the border, is that Venezuelans are desperately taking a small boat, what we call peñero in Spanish in Venezuela, or balsa, like the Cubans used to do, to get to Trinidad and Tobago, to get to Aruba and Curacao. And women are victims of human trafficking, especially women are suffering from human trafficking. And there are irregular groups also on the Caribbean, specifically at the east, the East Caribbean of Venezuela border, the Sucre state with Trinidad and Tobago, and they are suffering from smuggling and trafficking. So this situation is getting more complicated. I am convinced that Maduro is using COVID-19 to go deeper on repression and to go deeper on social control. And even though he announced a few days ago that that some flights will start again will start operations again in Venezuela. Again, is something something as discretion, because there are only 3 countries. There will be flights from Venezuela to Turkey, Mexico, and Dominican Republic. Some routes, for example, that you have in Caracas to Panama City are not yet announced to start. And the land and the border with Colombia and Brazil, there has not been any announcement of being open again. Those borders will be closed at least until November 12th. So I'll give this my opinion, maybe to close and listen to comments and questions. I hope I could be wrong. But I don't see Maduro's regime opening the borders again with Colombia and Brazil for the rest of 2020. Probably we will see flights again landing in Venezuela or taking off from Venezuela. But I'm not sure that we will see a reopening of the borders with Brazil or Colombia, because the pandemic has been a weapon for Maduro to go deeper on social control, to go deeper on repression, and to go deeper on human rights violation and crimes against humanity. Venezuela is completely isolated at the moment. They even could be compared with North Korea on the isolation, and I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying this. Even though, as I said, borders are open for 18 flights from Iran. But that doesn't mean that the border will be quiet. We will get more Venezuelans trying to get to Colombia through trochas. We will see more Venezuelans trying to get to Brazil through the jungle. And we will see more Venezuelans in desperation getting to the sea to try to get to the Caribbean. And if Maduro decides to open the border again with Brazil and Colombia, before COVID-19, 5,000 people were fleeing Venezuela every day through the regular borders with Colombia and Brazil. So if Maduro decides, which I think he will not, but if he decides to open the borders again, and of course there's no change in Venezuela, the dictatorship continues, we will see probably the worst waves and the most critical wave and of refugees since this crisis started. We will see the most dramatic outflow of refugees since this crisis started. If before COVID-19, 5,000 people were fleeing Venezuela, I would not be surprised that if the borders are open again, that number could go to 10,000 or 15,000, because people are in desperation in Venezuela because of the lack of medicine, the lack of food, because of lack of services, because of human rights violation and crimes against humanity. And something really important here is to also remark that Venezuelans are also fleeing because they are victims of crimes against humanity. When you see 9.3 people are in starvation according to the World Food Program, and 5.1 people, 5.5 people, 5.5 million Venezuelans have fled the country, we're talking of almost 15 million Venezuelans who are in a vulnerable situation regarding they are refugees or they are in starvation. 15 million Venezuelans are more than the population of Portugal. That's more than the population of Costa Rica. That's 3 times Costa Rica. That's 3 times Panama. That's 5 times Uruguay. That's more than the whole population of Cuba. So this is the most dramatic situation that the Western Hemisphere is having right now. This situation in Venezuela is not only impacting Venezuelans, it's impacting the region. And as I have always said, you need to have the humanitarian approach to protect, to integrate Venezuelan migrants and refugees, to providing the opportunities to work, to study, and to access to healthcare. But let's not forget the cost. The only solution to stop Venezuelans fleeing is restoring democracy and freedom in Venezuela. If you have a country that goes on a transition that could take people with rule of law, with democracy, with freedom, with opportunities, Venezuelans will stop fleeing, and you will create incentive for the ones who have fled to go back. So this is something very important, and Venezuelans need the help of the international community, which in my opinion, or it is a personal opinion, any option such as the responsibility to protect and others are legitimate right now in Venezuela to protect millions that are victims of crimes against humanity, human rights violation, and a humanitarian complex emergency. Thank you so much for inviting me.
David, thank you for very sobering analysis, but very astute and timely as well. Thank you very, very much for your comments, and again for your service indeed to the Venezuelan people and the hemispheric community. Let me pick up on something that you said. I don't think you used the word stateless, but let me put that word in your mouth if I can, because what you've described is refugees leaving a country and then returning or trying to return to a country that does not welcome them, does not claim them, and indeed tries to persecute them, at least in the minds of public opinion. What could be developing is a stateless population of Venezuelans outside the country that Venezuela itself will not acknowledge. How would that change the scenario, particularly for the international community? And would that raise the profile of the issue? It seems as if you want to raise money or have a political discussion, and you talk about Syrian refugees. The whole world comes to your door. If you want to talk about Venezuelan refugees, people go the other direction, and I've never understood that. I've never understood why that is, but maybe a whole stateless population in the northern part of South America and the Caribbean might change that. Do you have any thoughts on that in particular? And then we'll open up because we do have a few questions.
That's a very, very important question, Eric. Thank you so much. So approximately 2.5 million Venezuelans out of the 5.5 million don't have a passport, or have a passport that are about to expire, or don't have any identity at all. So we are already having cases of Venezuelans that are stateless, or we're having cases of Venezuelans that, even though they have their passport is expired, and they are in countries where Venezuelan expired passports are not allowed. So we've been working really hard on promote policies, for example, on countries to accept Venezuelan expired passports. I have to say, like countries from the US, the United Kingdom, Colombia, and Brazil, who are in borders. Just to give 4 examples, they are accepting Venezuelan expired passports. Of course, with their differences, there are some countries that they accept Venezuelan expired passport, or they ask you for a visa. There are countries that they accept Venezuelan expired passport, but they don't ask you for a visa, such as Brazil and Colombia. There are countries that they accept Venezuelan expired passports, but the expiration date has to happen when you are already in the country. For example, that's the case of Costa Rica. But I think we need the whole region on this, and our main proposal since this office at the OES started is that Venezuelans should be treated, and they should get the status of refugee. This is something that is still not happening. So when we talk to Venezuelans, this is not a population that you can call it that they are economic migrants. On their migrants, no, we are refugees. People are fleeing because of human rights violations, because crimes against humanity, because of a humanitarian complex emergency, because of lack of services, and because of foreign aggression. And I say foreign aggression because when I say that Venezuelans should be recognized as refugee, we always talk about the Cartagena Declaration. Cartagena Declaration expands the concept of refugee according to the UN, and says that refugee is someone who flees a country because of human rights violation, general violence, alteration of public order, and foreign aggression. And in my opinion, the 4 of them, including the foreign aggression, when you have at least 20,000 Cubans in Venezuela, or you have Russian troops that they are right now, as we speak, at the border of Bolivar State. That was something, huge news that happened this morning. There are Russian troops with Venezuelan armed forces uniforms right now in Santa Elena y Guairén, in border with Brazil. That's one of the big news today in the morning for Venezuela. Well, of course, that Venezuela should get the status of refugee. Brazil is doing that. If you get to Brazil, you can ask to get the refugee status, but that's not something that is going on in the whole region. Thanks.
Thanks, David. And I'm smiling just because of the complete double standard and hypocrisy that one would hear if Russian troops do that, and there's a big yawn across the hemisphere. Can you imagine if U.S. troops deployed to the border of Colombia or Brazil? The outcry of U.S. bases and invasion and all this stuff would be deafening.
But if I may, Eric, sorry, they are not in the border with Brazil. I mean, they're in the Venezuelan territory.
No, I mean that exactly.
They are not in even Brazil territory. They are already in Venezuelan territory. That happened this morning. So
no, exactly. Yeah. No, but I don't think U.S. troops would be welcomed into Venezuela these days. At least not by Maduro. Let me put it that way. Anyway, we're going to move on before I get myself into trouble here. We have a couple questions. We're going to start with Carlos Masal. Carlos, you're on screen already. If you could unmute, identify yourself, and ask the question to David, please. Carlos, if you could unmute, please.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And thank you, David. Let me just tell you as a background that I'm a naturalized Venezuelan citizen from Uruguay. I moved to Venezuela for looking for a job in 1975 when the situation was dire under a military dictatorship in my country. And we were not only well received, we were received with generosity, and we were welcomed. And I immediately got a rather important job with Fundación Mariscal de Cultura. And nobody ever asked me whether I was from Uruguay or anywhere else. So I have a debt of gratitude, and many Latin Americans, especially from the Southern Cone, have a debt of gratitude with Venezuela. So I haven't made a commitment to repay it in any way we can. So when I was in Uruguay, we organized everything for the arrival of Venezuelans, created NGOs. I negotiated with my own government, the possibility of them immediately getting to visas and getting to work. And so much so, and it proved so successful that very soon we had a classified section in our newsletter where Uruguayan private sector would ask for different types of skills and so on. So in that case, I can say that it was successful, but the numbers in Uruguay do not mean that much, 10, 15,000. But what you just said, this is a tragedy of historic dimensions, and it will not be over until this man and his cronies are gone. I was just going to suggest, because I know that we need to plan regardless. When I went back to Uruguay, I became deputy director of the National Commission on Repatriation. You cannot have 5.5 million Venezuelans returning to Venezuela without, in a fashion that it's not orderly. We did that for the Uruguayans. I remember I was one of the people who traveled to Sweden, Norway, wherever they were, to get them prepared. And then we got everything ready for their arrival, looking for jobs, seeing what the state could give them and everything. But imagine what they're coming back to. People are making 92 cents per month. What can they expect if they go back? The ones in Uruguay tell me, yeah, I'm ready to go back. But here I'm making money enough to send to my families and so on. So there are many things that need to be thought and discussed and agreed upon now, thinking that, yes, Maduro and the Cubans and the Russians will leave. And then we need to be ready. But I want to leave it like that. It's just that you have to take one step backwards to really read the situation without getting emotionally involved and so on. It is so dramatic that despite of the pandemic, the rest of the Latin America and countries like Spain and everything should be called upon, to behave in a generous way. Because Spain, Portugal, Italy always migrated to Venezuela at a certain time in history. So we need they need to reciprocate. And I leave it. I know that there are many other people that want to ask questions. But thank you, Eric, and thank you, David.
Carlos, thank you. That was, but that was a very important intervention because you really brought a regional perspective and a historical perspective. And it goes to what David was saying about, Venezuela used to be a recipient of refugees and do so willingly and generously of folks from around the region. And now it's sending orders of magnitude more to the region. It's a real reversal of roles, isn't it? Thank you for raising that. David, before we ask you to respond, let me bring a couple additional folks into the conversation and lump them together and then ask you for some thoughts. We'll go next, although Mike, I'm jumping you ahead in the queue because of protocol purposes. Let's go next to former Ambassador Michael Skoll, who's also a former boss of mine at the State Department, and he still scares me with the possibility of what he could say about my Caribbean son. So, Mike, I'm going to turn the microphone to you. Please go off mute, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Eric. You're not guilty of anything that I can think of at the moment. I'd like to ask David about Colombia and the fact that there is, in a sense, a Venezuelan created humanitarian crisis in Colombia with so many Venezuelans there. Last time I was in Bogota in February, everyone on the street selling something seemed to be a Venezuelan. Colombia is not in good shape right now with COVID and a number of other things. David, are you foreseeing a worsening humanitarian crisis in Colombia?
That's another important question. And then we'll take as our third one for this round, Guillermo Zubiaga. Guillermo, as you're coming on screen and unmuting, Guillermo just posted onto the chat a copy or the link of the report that David was talking about. So those who care to see it, you can pull it down from there. Guillermo, to you, please.
Thank you, Eric. My question is similar to Ambassador Skoll, is not only in Colombia, but also in Peru, that we're seeing upcoming elections. And in the Caribbean, David, in Trinidad and Tobago, if you could just speak a little bit about the treatment that some of these refugees have received as the economic conditions continue to worsen. We've seen, examples of some xenophobia, and I don't know if you're doing something at the OAS, but we'd love to hear a little more about what you're seeing in those countries and how politics, it's using some of these populations. Thank you so much.
David, to you, please.
Thank you for the questions and comments. Well, Carlos, Uruguay, I used to play soccer, and my head coach was a Uruguayan. So that was the Venezuela that we used to have. I was a kid in that moment, but my grandparents and my father are immigrants. I used to study where one of my best friends was. His parents came from Portugal. Another good friend of mine, her parents came from Spain, and that was Venezuela, but not anymore. Uruguay right now, there are 15,000 Venezuelan migrants and refugees. This is not a small number. On relative number, 0.5% of the whole population of Uruguay already are Venezuelans. It is 3 million. And Uruguay is one of the countries that has increased more its total of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Just during the last approximately 15 months, that it has gone 5 times. Last year, there were only 3,000 Venezuelans, migrants, and refugees in Uruguay. Now there are 15,000, 5 times. So this is something important to have it in mind, because, as I said again, if the borders are open and we have this new wave of people fleeing Venezuela, I will not be surprised if you see that 15,000 going up, or even things are happening. Venezuelans from Brazil or from Argentina or from Chile getting to Uruguay. So we're also having those outflows already outside Venezuela. I agree with you. The dream is to have 5 million people going back to Venezuela, but that's something that historically doesn't happen with refugees and with diaspora, even though this has been a very unusual refugee crisis. Historically, what we have learned is that between 20 or 30% as its best gone back to Venezuela. But one of the things that we're starting to work is how the diaspora could be more proactive, not only to accelerate transition, but on the rebuilding of Venezuela, and how a democratic government of Venezuela in the future could create incentives for people to repatriate. So any experience that you had in Uruguay will be great to learn from it, because I am convinced that by the time Venezuela gets to a transition and hopefully to a democratic elected government, we will need Venezuelans who are abroad to rebuild the country. while they're outside, or if you create policies to get them back, and that's something that has not been worked. That is why that's one of the things that we would like to work, especially by 2021. Ambassador Michael, it's a pleasure to see you here. Colombia has been incredible with Venezuelans. 1.8 million Venezuelans had gotten to Colombia. Approximately 43% of those Venezuelans have the permiso especial de permanencia, which is the special permission to stay in Colombia for at least 2 years, and you become regular, and you have the opportunities to get integrated to labor markets and have a better access to healthcare and education. Venezuelans are now the 4th largest city in Colombia, the 4th largest. Only Bogota, Medellin, and Cali are bigger than Venezuelans. If all Venezuelans go to a city in Colombia, it will be the 4th largest already in population. So this is something Venezuelans in Colombia are already larger than the population of Cartagena, Barranquilla, Santa Marta, Bucaramanga. So Colombia has become, in this part of the world, what it used to be Turkey with Syria years ago, getting Syrian refugees. So of course, the situation could get worse when you are in a pandemic. Just to give you a number, Ambassador, 70% of women that are giving birth in Cucuta are already Venezuelans. On this situation that Venezuelans are trying to get back to their country, with the United Nations, they had to install some refugee camps, temporary refugee camps, to have people there. Of course, there are lack of services and resources. So if we have new refugee outflows to Colombia, the situation could get worse. We need more support from the international community. The Syrian refugee crisis have received approximately 17 times more money than the countries that are receiving Venezuelans. And I have to say that the United States has been the biggest donor on this crisis, and then the European Union, but it is important to get the whole international community supporting not only Venezuelans, but the receiving countries that they have lack of services, lack of budget, and lack of infrastructure. And what Guillermo asked, this is very important. In Peru is one of the countries in South America where we have received more denounces of xenophobia. Let's remember that Peru, and this is something that maybe is not that well known, is the second receiving countries of Venezuelan migrants and refugees, approximately 900,000. It has not gotten to the million because of COVID-19, because all the projections were that Peru will become the second country with more than 1 million Venezuelans. And one of the things that is very specifically of Peru is that you see in Colombia Venezuelans almost in every city, but in Peru, 8 out of 10 Venezuelans are in Lima or metropolitan Lima. So Peru has implemented the permiso temporal de permanencia, temporary permission, where more than 50% of Venezuelan migrants and refugees have gotten that, even though Peru has asked Venezuela now for visas since last year, which is my opinion. We disagree with that. But something interesting happened in Peru recently due to COVID-19, that all nurses and doctors from Venezuela, refugees from Venezuela in Peru, now with some flexibility on the university decree, they could become part of the Peruvian health system. And I think that was a great step forward to give opportunity to great doctors and nurses that Venezuela have, and hopefully other countries could do the same. Trinidad and Tobago, I say, and I take responsibility of what I'm going to say, the worst country for Venezuelans to go. The worst country for Venezuelans to go. And this is something political, because one of the best allies that Maduro has in the Caribbean is the government of Trinidad and Tobago. I asked the government of Trinidad and Tobago almost 18 months ago to visit that country, like the way I have visited so many countries in the region, and it has been the only one that has not gotten a response. In Trinidad and Tobago, at least there are 40,000 Venezuelans, migrants, and refugees. They say that there are less, that there are 20,000. They made a registration last year of Venezuelans there, and it only took 2 weeks. So people didn't have the time or didn't know about it. So many Venezuelans are suffering from aggression, xenophobia, deportations, illegal detentions, human trafficking. So I ask, please, all the people who are here to put more pressure and to put more to follow more closely what was going on in Trinidad and Tobago. And I have to say that we have already started a report of Venezuelans victims of human trafficking focused on the Caribbean. And as soon as we release it, I'm going to share it with the Council of Americas as the way that we did with this one. Thanks.
David, thank you very much. And it's good to hear you talk in such direct and frank terms. I mean, you can't address an issue unless you know that an issue exists. So we appreciate that openness. One country that hasn't been brought up yet, but also one of Venezuela's neighbors is Guyana. And I wonder, given what you just said about TNT, what about Trinidad and Tobago, are you seeing similar issues there? Is it an issue at all? And then layer on top of that, this literally gusher of new money, and no pun intended, but that's coming into Guyana. Is there somehow a way to utilize that in a positive way for some of the regional refugee issues? Obviously, these are sovereign funds of the government of Guyana. It's not for me to tell them how to spend their money, but do you have any thoughts along those lines?
We have not seen the situation in Guyana as bad as in Trinidad and Tobago. It's more that the border is, of course, very complicated to basically to get there. There are more than 23,000 Venezuelans in Guyana, which is a big number in Guyana. The most concerning thing is human trafficking. Since 2018, and this is shattering, since 2018, Venezuelans became the first nationality victims of human trafficking in Guyana, even more than others, such as Cubans, Dominicans, Grenadians, and 90% of the victims are women 27 years old or younger. So I think this is the biggest challenge that the government of Guyana has, of course, with the humanitarian aid that they could provide. So again, when we talk about the donations that the receiving country needs, of course, I'm aware of Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, but this is something everywhere. And we have to put more focus on the Caribbean because Venezuelans are very vulnerable there and also are victims or other type of irregular group that are not the ones like ELN or colectivos that we always listen.
Yeah, and the Caribbean has long been an enigma to policymakers in the United States, hasn't it? I mean, you get individual votes in important bodies like the OAS out of the Caribbean basin, but there's a lot of diplomatic work that can be done there. Also, there seems to be some residual allegiance anyway to the Venezuelan regime, at least from some countries in the Caribbean. So that plays into these issues as well. Very, very interesting comments, David. Very interesting. I know our time is short. We have at least one more question that we do need to get to, given the fact that we're in a political moment in the United States. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you for your predictions about November 3rd. That's not what I'm going to do. But there is one point of divergence between the two campaigns that is a clear, bright line, and that is the granting of temporary protected status to Venezuelans in the United States. And I'm not asking you to get involved in U.S. politics, but is there, from a refugee perspective, from a migratory perspective, what would that do, or would it make much impact at all on the situation in Venezuela were the United States to offer TPS to Venezuelans in the country?
Thank you for the question, Eric. Well, first of all, I have always had to remind, and I have been living in exile for 3 years in Washington, D.C. Eric was one of the first person that I met. The Venezuelan efforts to restore democracy and freedom have been bipartisan. And it is very important during this campaign and whatever happens on November 3rd to maintain the goal of restore democracy and freedom in Venezuela as a bipartisan issue. And as we saw it when President Guaido came to the State of the Union, that everyone was clapping because of the efforts that he's leading. I have to say that this administration, I think, has given has taken step forward on protecting Venezuelans, such as being one of the first to accept the Venezuelan expired passports. That this could sound basic, but you don't know how much that means for so many Venezuelans that they cannot get a passport in Venezuela because it's a whole corruption network. Second, as I said, this administration has led the biggest donation for the humanitarian crisis, and specifically the refugee crisis. And hopefully we can see the TPS get approved. Of course, this is something that I'm totally agree, and I have spoken this with Senator Rubio, with Senator Menendez, and hopefully this could get approved, because it will benefit not the whole Venezuelans who are in the U.S., because not everyone is eligible for apply to our TPS, but a lot will be benefited, and especially young Venezuelans who also will benefit the U.S., because we are talking of very smart young Venezuelans who got work and entrepreneur in this country. And talking politically, sorry if I go beyond a little bit. I hope that after what happened yesterday in Bolivia, the last country that I visited to the region before COVID-19 was Bolivia, and I was amazed with what I saw. 10,000 Venezuelans are in Bolivia. And they get through walking and through jungles, and they were invisible for so many years while Evo Morales was there. And I have to say that this transitional government made very interesting policies to protect Venezuelans in Bolivia, such as accepting expired documents, giving Bolivian nationality to kids that are born there with moms from Venezuela. I hope that this new government that was elected yesterday in Bolivia protect Venezuelans there, and we will not see massive deportations or persecutions to Venezuelans, because they have gotten to Bolivia fleeing from a regime that is involved in crimes against humanity.
Yeah, let me second that sentiment, no question about it. And one of the things I think that President-elect Arce could do that would make a lot of difference would be to separate himself from the previous president and to chart his own course, and this would clearly be one way that he could contribute to do that. Well, as you can hear from the chimes in the background from my clock, we are at the appointed time, and I apologize for that interruption, although at least it's not a barking dog. This is the other interruption I get from working at home all the time. We have additional questions that we're not going to be able to get to, including the role of Iran in the country, and more on Russia, a little bit on China. What would the Biden administration mean for Venezuela? These sorts of questions. These are on the minds of people, David. What that means is you have to come back. You have to join us again at some point in the near future to continue the conversation. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to do so. But I really want to say thank you. And I also want to reiterate, David, what I said at the very beginning. It's hard to do what you're doing on behalf of your country as a patriot for your country and your people. You don't get a lot of thanks for it. It's hard work. There's a lot of persecution. There's personal risk. And so we applaud your efforts and thank you for them, and count on us to continue to try to come alongside, do what we can, to at least at a minimum, to raise the visibility of these issues, and hopefully to do much more as well. So again, thank you for joining us. Any final thoughts?
Eric, no, thank you so much for your kind words. My only motivation is to be back in Venezuela, to have the opportunity to give a hug again to my parents who are there, to be someone who can just provide opportunities to millions of Venezuelans who have fled, especially from a generation that we don't know what is to live in democracy. We don't know what is to live in freedom. And my last thought is that don't take democracy and freedom for granted. Venezuela probably is the best example right now in the world how democracy was used to destroy democracy. Hugo Chavez used all the democratic tools that Venezuela had to conquer power, and from power, destroy democracy. And unfortunately, my country has become now something even worse than a failed state. So modern dictators doesn't need to do a coup d'etat or take a tank to a palace. They are now using technology. They're now using elections to install their dictatorship. So the sooner we restore democracy in Venezuela, not only better for Venezuelans, but better for the region. I think it will be something amazing when that happens. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's been a master class, hasn't it, about using democracy to take down democracy. Goodness knows we should do at the Council of the Americas, I'm talking to myself, but also to my colleagues on the line as well, we should do a program in the near future about precisely that. What are the things that were done? How was it done? Not just to revisit the Venezuela example, but to be perfectly honest, to show the rest of the region, indeed other democracies, how it's done so that they can be wary of it and resist it. Really important points, David. I just wish we could continue the conversation. As I say, we'll have to do so again in the future. Thanks, everybody, for joining us again at the Council of the Americas. Hope to see you again very, very soon. You know where to reach us. Please don't be shy. Be in contact, and we will be in contact with you very soon as well. Until then, be safe. Talk to you soon.